This is a small tutorial demo showing how to exchange tokens in scenarios where you want to perhaps use an async job queue or something more long-lived, where the the data needs to be more bound to the token, and you probably also want to have that token restricted with fewer scope of access and fewer claims or internal claims in that token. So the setup is this. We have a client um, that can run any OAuth flow to retrieve an access token. So it requests scopes to begin with that are the full set of scopes. Um, One of the particular scopes it has is the exchange scope that we define in this example. That can be anything, but I called it exchange. Uh, it uses this access token to call an API. The API can then exchange this token for another access token. And the way that this is set up now is that if the incoming token has the scope exchange and the client is configured with a certain set of properties, we will downscope that token and make sure it contains the attributes we want or the claims we want. And it will also get a much longer expiration time than the original token. We can also then pass in something that we want to bind into this token, like the signature of the data that it should be used together with or something like that. And then the API can call the next API or the job queue, whatever it may be, with this exchanged token instead. So there's a few things we need to set up in Curity in order to do this. First of all, um, we need to define some scopes. So I created two scopes. I created an exchange scope and an internal scope. I also created some claims. So I want a certain value to be provided in the token or a claim when the access token 2 is used, when we use the internal token or the sync token, we can call it. So I created a claim which just has some random data in it right now, and I mapped it to the scope, internal scope. But what's interesting is in Curity you can define under what conditions is this claim inserted into a token. And by default, you have access token, ID token, and user info. But I don't want this claim to be in any of those. I just want the claim to be in the tokens that we use internally for this particular purpose. So if we click edit now on our mapper, I use the default mapper here, we can see that I have these three by default, but I can also add custom mapping. So I've added one called a sync token. And here I say the purpose of this mapping is access tokens, and the only claim that I want to add, except the standard claims for access tokens, is the internal claim. So this means when we create a mapper or when we use the mapping a sync token, we will get an access token data that we can issue with the internal claim in it. Then on the client, I've defined a client that has a bunch of capabilities. It has token exchange right now because I'll use the same client for both getting the token and exchanging it, but they could be different clients. It can ask for the exchange scope and the internal scope. Then I've configured some properties on this client. I've created three. One called AT audience, which we set to what the audience should be of this token that we issue in the exchange flow. What mapping to use, and here I use that mapping that I defined over there called the async token mapping. So those claims are the ones that should be mapped into this token. And I also set what scope do I want in this final token, and that would be the internal scope only. And in order to bind this together, I've created a procedure that I use on the token exchange endpoint. It's called D. That's a dumb name, but it looks like this. So here we get the incoming token for exchange. We pull out the scopes, and then we read here the properties on the client that I just showed you. So we read the AT scope, the AT audience, and the claims mapping. And we also get from the request some extra data if we want that. Be careful when using inbound data and putting it into tokens because it's not issued then by the token server. So you trust something that came in. So be very aware when using that type of mechanism. And then we check, so if the scope that is in the token that came in here, the first access token contains exchange, and we have these three properties set on the client, we will use a function called getDefaultData, which can take a string of the mapping we want to use. So this is a very useful API when we want to use custom mappings, because we can still use the claims framework in Curity, but we can use other mappings than the three default ones for access token, ID token, and user info. So I defined on the client that I wanted that async mapping, and that's the one that's passed in here. So this data is now pre-populated with the default access token data values, but also that internal claim now is in here and resolved. And I also update the expiration here to be something because I wanted it longer. I set the scope now specifically to be that AT scope that we've defined on the client, the audience specifically to what we set on the client. And then I add that extra data to something called client provided data, just to give it a name that makes sure this is not coming from the server. And then I issue this. Now in this case, I use the default access token JOT issuer, so I will get a JOT as the internal one. And then I return this to the client. If the client or the incoming token doesn't contain this exchange scope, I will throw a forbidden exception and return client not authorized. So let's start. So if we go to OAuth tools, I'll run this. So first I'll ask for the exchange scope and the internal scope, and I'll run a flow. I'm single signed on. So I got an opaque token here on the outside. So let's look at that. So we can see now that Jacob logged in. It has the exchange and internal scope. The issuer was this. The audience, client 1, audience 2, that's interesting. So that's the external audiences we used here. And then the expiration is pretty short. It's 5 minutes from now. And there are no other claims in here that are custom. So let's copy this token and use the exchange flow, and I'll use Postman for that. So I add this token in, I use a client, and now we use this exchange grant type that we have in Curity. And I downscope it, so the exchange endpoint takes a scope parameter to what scopes you want to downscope to this token. So you can't upscope, you can only downscope. And I also pass in some extra data, my extra data here. So when I send this, I get a new access token back, and you can see the expiration now is 1 hour, not 5 minutes as it was in the beginning. And let's look at this token that we got now. If we go to the JOT token endpoint or the JOT token decoder in OAuth tools, we can see that this token has the scope internal scope only, same subject still. Audience is now the audience we described in the client properties. Still an access token purpose. We see the client provided data, my extra data that I passed in. And we also see this internal claim now issued some value. So even though the scope, internal scope was used for both the external token and the internal token, the mapper made sure that we only got the claim in the token that was going to be sent to this inner API, or this async API in this case. I also recommend, if you haven't worked with properties and custom issuers and these things, to take a look at the video using custom token issuers on our website. You'll find it under resources, videos. It explains a few of these concepts as well and how to work with the token procedures.